had a lively and thoughtful exchange yesterday. I hope that can happen in the morning, too. You can be like Lowell and get your caffeine, if that helps. Our objectives for today are to come to a shared understanding about the progress to date, next steps moving forward, and in between that, we'd like to get your feedback on some other feedback on the evaluation criteria framework. So, like I said, we had some really nice, thoughtful interaction yesterday. Let's see, do we turn it to you first, Kirk, and then go to our liaisons, or?
Sure. We just wanted to open up questions first. There was a large email update on Thursday, just a lot of information to see if folks had any questions on it, and then we turn it over to Monica to give a quick update on the Citizen Business Group yesterday, and Kevin.
I had a quick update, or a quick question about the email. The attachment about the private wells, was that finalized and we can send that out to our neighborhoods? Just wanted to make sure before I send it out.
I'm going to look at Gary. I don't think we're envisioning other changes to that document. And that document is about the expectations, what to expect with neighborhood hookups using settlement dollars is what she's referring to. Yeah, and I think that's good to go. Would it be helpful? Do we have it on state letterhead? Would that be helpful than just a white piece of paper?
I don't remember if it is, but it would be.
Yeah, that would be.
Okay. Well, we'll double check. And if it's not, we'll get you another version.
Yes. Thanks to that kind gentleman that was here.
You'll only get 5,000 steps in today. Okay, from the group yesterday, we did have quite a bit of discussion on a couple of these issues. One of them that was most interesting to me was a little discussion about maybe spending more now on capital projects and at the expense of the long-term O&M. I mean, we've had some discussions over time about, hey, should we be setting aside monies for O&M for the perpetuity kind of thing, and that was a bit of a discussion.
What was your conclusion?
Well, there really wasn't one, because part of it is, it kind of depends on what some of the capital costs are, for these projections that come up. And that's a lot of why we hired Wood, because they've got some expertise in that area. So with the conceptual projects, I believe part of that is also going to involve some estimates of cost. I'm looking at some Wood people, and am I getting a head nod? Yes. Yeah, that was kind of the intent of some of this stuff. But we had to start with just kind of sorting out what conceptual projects were even viable. So.
Context of moving toward zero.
Yeah, this whole thing about getting to zero detect everywhere, which again is still a moving number because of, as we get further analytical expertise, right now we're down to parts per trillion. Well, I don't even know what the next order of magnitude is. I don't go out that far. But anyway, that was part of it. They've got these easel boards up in the back, and so we had a little bit of input for more information that might be provided when they do have the public meetings next week. We had some discussion when we get around to this project 1007 update about, right now we really are focused on the key PFA sites, in Oakdale, the county dump, and then down in Woodbury, but they noted that there could be other people that were using those types of chemicals that may have also contributed, and we had some discussion about, well, how do you identify them? Right now they're going to work off industrial codes, but that's going to be an iffy proposition. And other than that, Kevin, did you have anything else you wanted to add in on that?
Typically not very much, Monica, pretty good, but
To the
conversation about basically spend the money now and build what we have to build or save for later. A lot of that was really based on especially one person that's been pushing this issue for the whole process. If we can get to something close to zero detect, because I don't think we're ever going to get to zero detect, because detect changes, maybe it makes more sense to spend more now and not save as much for later, because we've pushed our new drinking water systems so far into the good, if that makes any sense at all. And that was really, I think, what he was driving at. And then the other interesting conversation that I'm really looking forward to hearing how this group works through it was the question of, should LGUs have sign-off authority or ability on a small rural drinking well system? And I'll just leave that lay there, and we'll get there eventually, because that was a spirited conversation yesterday.
An independent.
Well, and that's part of the chat I guess we're going to have, but, being 20-plus years in local government, I felt like local government should have something to say about what happens within its confines when it comes to drinking water, sanitary sewer, storm sewer, the things that city governments do. But there were folks in the room that are more rural or maybe in the well industry that disagreed with me, right? That's kind of how that went. So then I just shut up because I was losing. So that's all I was going to add. Please.
So a number of folks have mentioned this goal of getting to zero detect a number of times, and I just want to maybe understand what folks think that means, and maybe it sounds simple to some folks, but if zero detect means for PFAS in general, I don't think that's at all realistic. If it's zero detect for PFOA or PFOS, that's fine, but you'll never get rid of PFBA. It's all over the metro area. And so I think if we're going to continue down this path of talking about zero detect, I'd really like for us to define what zero detect means.
Oh, please.
And this is where terms and semantics become really important, and I'm the last person perhaps to talk about the details of chemistry, but as I understand it, it's not zero detect, it's to the lowest detectable level. Okay, because you're right, you don't get to zero detect, but technology changes, acceptable health-based indexes change, and at least for Woodbury's, we've wrestled with, if we go to treatment, what are we designing our system for becomes really difficult. Because we could say it's going to be, 0.5 parts per trillion, and then the latest level undercuts us. And so the thought is, the technology would take us so far. And so guide the technology aspects to get to the lowest detectable level possible, given the technology that's available. But I think one of the state staff urged us not to say zero, because we aren't going to get to zero. So the key words from our standpoint is lowest detectable level and using the best technology. That's why we're interested in going beyond, the GAC approved level that the state has and looking at a couple of the other options out there for water treatment that might actually be more helpful technology to get to a lower detectable level. So does that sort of explain it a little bit better, hopefully?
Not really, but.
And to be clear, it was the so-called neutral facilitator who used the word zero a while ago. You'll have a chance to talk thoughtfully about that.
Yeah, this topic of PFBA and how it is different than PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, we're going to have a good conversation on it coming up when we probably either in the priorities to build off of that conversation. Christina, you mentioned it was a good chunk of yesterday's conversation, and also when we get to what Wood is going to run on scenarios for that various piece. And so we're going to get it a little more into the weeds Lucas and Carla are going to help us talk about how the systems interact with PFBA and that. So we're going to keep talking about it. So we'll maybe all get clear.
And what the other thing I just wanted to mention too in this conversation about treating to zero detect or whatever we're going to call it, but there was two pieces to this. There was the if you're going to treat an area, what do you treat to? And then there was, are you going to treat areas or be ready to treat areas that may not have a health-based value exceedance or even a detect at this point? And so there was, both of those conversations went on yesterday as well, in depth.
Sounds like Kirk's got kids at home. Got a little cold going on. Yeah. Are we ready for Gary? Anything else?
Monica mentioned it. We've got our public meetings next week. The second one will be televised, thankfully, by our partners that are televising today. And just a reminder about it, and thank you for all the local units of government that put it on their websites and on their emails, put it on their newsletters. We appreciate that. And as mentioned during the break, there are a couple poster boards back here. One of the things during the open house part of the public meeting we want to talk about is our goals. Let me back up. The goals for the public meeting are really to start educating the public about the process that's so far and what's to come, and start getting familiar with some of the projects that are being looked at. So when we come back to them in January with modeling data and costs, they're not all trying to get up to speed at once, that we try to ease them into the issue and so they can start thinking about some of these things. For instance, West Lakeland. What does West Lakeland want to look like in the future? Those type of things to start that conversation. So that's one of the goals for our meeting next week. The other is Department of Health is going to have a conversation about health-based values, what's being done, the standards changes that had been done locally and globally, just to make sure folks understand we are still always on top of the most recent science, using that into our decision-making and how our decision-making continues to evolve. That's something we heard from this group and the Citizen Business Group that they really wanted to have at the meeting, and so that will be the other focus of the public meeting.
Thank you, Kirk. Also, I forgot to mention this earlier. Back in April, we asked for your feedback on that particular meeting, and on the overall process. In May, we briefly shared with you the results of that evaluation and brought forward our ideas about how to address your feedback. We were really grateful for that. And if you had any other ideas, some people said they didn't recall that. So if you want to see that summary of the evaluations posted somewhere or in some other form, let us know. But we are doing it again today, and so if you would just take a minute by the end of the meeting to give us some feedback, we'd be really grateful. Thank you. Gary Pulford on Project 1007.
Gary Pulford. That's definitely an inside comment, I would say. I'll leave it at that, okay. Okay. Thank you, Milt. Again, I was just going to give you a quick update on what's termed Project 1007. I think, Clint, you asked about what was that. Yeah, it's not. I like the term 1007, but I'll stick with 1007. This was actually what's termed Project 1007 was actually a stormwater flood control system constructed by the Valley Branch Watershed District, probably back in like the late 1980s. To control surface water and flooding. A lot of it's along Lake Elmo, the lake, but also through that whole Valley Branch system. So again, it was back in the 1980s to transport, control stormwater, flood control, from up, I think the Tri-Lakes, what they call like Lake Montreville area, up through, down past, unfortunately past Washington County landfill, into Raleigh Creek, and then ultimately through Lake Elmo, the city and lake. And ultimately out to the east into West Lakeland area, and what that ended up being was really the transport mechanism to transfer PFAS from basically from west to east across Lake Elmo and into West Lake and towards the St. Croix. So I just want to give you an update on the project and where we're at with that. Again, this is the one
really specifically identified project or in the settlement agreement with 3M this last year was really spelled out right in the agreement that the MPCA will conduct a source water and feasibility study regarding the role of this Project 1007 as the conveyance of PFCs in the environment. So it's one item that was specifically called out, one directive basically to the MPCA to conduct this assessment. I guess what I could really term it as is kind of the Superfund terminology is almost like a remedial investigation feasibility study of determining the extent and magnitude of PFCs in this project area. With that, we did hire on AECOM environmental consultants. I think they've been at some of these meetings. AECOM is one of our Superfund multi-site contractors. They're very familiar with the 3M sites. Through all the cleanup actions at the 3M sites, AECOM provided engineering and technical assistance for the cleanup actions at the Oakdale site along with Woodbury and Cottage Grove. So they're familiar with the 3M projects. They've done work on PFAS in Minnesota and other states. So we brought them on board to do this assessment, and we were throughout the whole beginning of the process, developing sampling plans, developing work plans. We worked closely with Valley Branch staff and MDH in developing the study that it's underway now. This in reality, I mean, this kind of shows the transport of the PFAS from again west to east across the county. At both the disposal sites, Oakdale and Washington County, you have PFAS impacting the surface water, but also into surface water here. I'm sorry. This is really the Raleigh Creek, which really originates right at the Oakdale disposal site, flows from west into east into Lake Elmo, and of course, then Raleigh Creek is a losing stream, so a lot of that water that with PFAS in it migrated down into groundwater and impacted a number of wells, private wells just south of Raleigh Creek. Of course, then you also had surface water flow from the Washington County landfill, operating, converging with Raleigh Creek there, and then ultimately flowing, continuing to flow east, continuing to migrate into groundwater, surface water, again migrating over into Lake Elmo. And actually, part of the construction of Project 1000 is a pipe underneath Lake Elmo to help control flooding along the east side of the lake. Of course, that discharges, both groundwater and surface water discharges into groundwater again, surface water flow, and then obviously getting into West Lakeland and into groundwater and impacting wells in the West Lakeland area. And down along here, it actually enters into MnDOT controlled stormwater piping, ultimately then out to the St. Croix. So again, this was the kind of discovered through the residential well sampling, kind of this pathway, this transport pathway of PFCs across Lake Elmo and into West Lakeland. And this is really kind of a map of our sampling plan, our sampling effort that were initially called our baseline sampling effort, which took place. A lot of this work took place here in August, late August. We're just starting to get some results in, so we don't really have all the data in from the surface water and sediment sampling. But if you kind of see the orange squares are kind of like the sampling points along the pathway. So we took both surface water sediment samples kind of along the whole pathway, kind of get a baseline evaluation of this. Second step will be to conduct some more what we're calling beta sampling, as more groundwater sampling efforts, more nested wells in various areas to kind of see that surface water groundwater interaction and see where we can possibly look at some mitigative measures. So again, this past August was our surface water sediment sampling, about 150 samples. Beta sampling we're determining is here in the next couple of months as far as some additional nested wells to look at that interconnections, working closely also not with just MDH and Valley Branch, but also MGS service to look at, where's the best and optimal locations to put some of these nested wells. Based on that data, we may do some additional focus investigations and possibly some, identified areas, or maybe higher concentrations or potential source areas. Combine all those efforts together to look at now getting into that feasibility area as far as some potential mitigative measures to mitigate, have some possible options as far as maybe some source removal, sediment removal, groundwater control systems. I mean, that's kind of planned for into late summer next year as far as starting that FS portion of the process. So again, when we get more data, we'll get more results in. We plan to probably come back to the work groups and see, here's what we found as far as our baseline sampling effort, and see where we're going, next steps with the study. So, yeah. Monica? Oh.
Is there a feeling that we are continuing to add to the PFAS burden? Is the stuff like leaching out of these big source places in Oakdale and the county landfill? I mean, is there any feel for that? Or is it stuff that's already gone out and it's just sitting there?
A lot of it probably has already gotten out, but we're monitoring what's at the Oakdale disposal site as far as control measures at the site itself. And part of the sampling effort will kind of see, well, are we still getting some releases from the site and also from the Washington County landfill. And then part of that probably evaluation will look at, if that is still occurring, what can we do to stop those continued releases. But I think a lot of what we're seeing in groundwater, especially over in West Lakeland, was that historical.
Historically, it already got away.
I mean, it's kind of like the groundwater plumes, there's a lot of historical releases that occurred.
Because I live just south of the Oakdale site, and I remember when they dug all that stuff out. I mean, they really took a lot of dirt with it, thank goodness. And even when they finally did that last bit on the north side of County 14, I mean, they really, I think they took a good bit of dirt with it. So I would think, I mean, there's got to be just a finite amount of material left. I mean, but when you're talking parts per trillion, that gets really tough to deal with.
That's kind of the case. You're talking such low concentrations.
Yeah.
And really, in the last round of actions that 3M undertook at Oakdale, they added in additional groundwater control wells kind of more along where the creek originates. So for years, though, there wasn't any. So, you know, so that's kind of part of that effort at the site, is to really continue to reevaluate that site remedy. Is that working, or isn't it working, what might we do to enhance that, or is needed on the part of 3M? So.
Because is there any thought with all this project work that we may have to dig out more material? I mean, is there still any remnant of leaking whatever in there?
I think, my guess is we probably remove as much as we can at the sites. I mean, of course, Washington County landfill, you have a triple liner in place, so there's nothing. And again, 3M did quite a bit of removal this last round. I mean, they took out all the barrels back in the 80s, the original source removal. They did additional source removal, you know, in like 2008, 9, I think Jim was at about the time frame. Right. So, you know, there's been a lot of source removal done at the site. Now, again, is there some potential, you know, buildup in sediments along Riley Creek that we could look at? That's all part of this evaluation to see, are there some possible options to do that now?
Gary, I just have a procedural favor to ask. It looks like there's going to be more testing or site visits per your previous slide of going out there. Will you please just let me know, like the week before? Our residents are very skeptical when somebody shows up at their door and wants to access the lake through their property or something like that. Thankfully, I knew about it last time because I wanted to use one of our parks as well, but if I could just ask to get a little heads up when we get those calls.
Apologize for not letting you, but we'll let you know when our next plans are.
I'm just thinking, Gary, that we're in a very wet period right now, and so I'm guessing that we've seen maybe, I don't know if the flush of the system is not the right terminology, but maybe a lot of transport going on right now due to the high water, the saturation of the soil, everything is full. So there might be, I would guess, natural periods of less or more, and we're going to have to build in somehow in
we certainly recognize this year was a wet year, especially when we were sampling Raleigh Creek. I think for a while 3M was monitoring that, and most often in summer months there's no water there, so there really wasn't any surface water to monitor. So we recognize this was a high water year, so to speak, and so.
Now Tara will seek your feedback on the framework.
Great, thank you. All right. Today we wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about the Priority 1 draft evaluation framework that we sent out last month and we requested feedback on. So we received comments back from 4 people on this document, and we just thought that it'd be helpful to just really walk through those comments together to see, get your kind of thoughts on the comments, if they make sense, potentially kind of think of some potential ways to address them, so then we can take those feedback and revise the document and share it with you all at the next meeting. So we did the same thing at the citizen business group yesterday, just really kind of walking through and getting feedback. In some cases there were, differences of opinion, so we just really want to hear that as well and, try to figure out kind of the best way to address the comments moving forward.
And differences of interpretation too that we clarified.
Yep, that's a good point.
Remind us how you can use this.
Yes, actually I have a slide, if I can pull that up, that'd be helpful. Oh, not that. Yeah, so we talked about using these criteria really at the very last step of this process. So after the scenarios are developed by Wood and the costing is done and the modeling is done and the results have come in, to really then use a criteria and apply them at the scenario level, and more in a qualitative way to try to have the trustees come up with what we're calling their good, better, best scenario. So using this to kind of evaluate those different scenarios. So again, it's not applied to specific projects, it's the bundles of projects that make up those scenarios. Does that?
Just explain that again. So it's not bundles, not specific.
Sorry, yeah. So a scenario is a group of projects. So it's a group of projects that address, that's for the whole 14 communities. So then these criteria are not going to be applied to a specific project, that they're going to be applied to that set of projects for all 14 communities.
How does that, so who puts sets together and how does that set development?
Yeah, so Wood will be, so that's actually what they're working on now. So they've developed these lists of conceptual projects, and then they're going to be bundling these projects into a scenario. And then the scenario will basically be a set of projects that address the water supply for all 14 communities. So they're coming up with those. We talked about having the treatment scenario, the community level scenario, the integrated scenario, and the regional scenario.
And you'll be demonstrating that a little later, right?
Yeah,
Yep.
we'll talk about that later.
Yep, so they'll be, so they're going to be developing these scenarios, and then running those scenarios with the groundwater and drinking water modeling, and then developing costs for each of those scenarios. So after all of that, they'll be developing the results of all the modeling, and then we'll be taking that to then look at kind of each of those scenarios and see how they address these sets of criteria. And then using that to come up with a recommendation of what are those scenarios that kind of rise to the top that meet these different criteria. Does that help? Okay. Yeah, so again, it's not going to be used for individual projects. It's going to be used at this kind of larger scale at the scenario level, which will be a whole set of projects that are addressing drinking water for the whole 14 communities.
Scenario could be 30 projects.
Mm-hmm.
Each scenario could be like 30 individual projects.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that since we only received comment from 4 people, we did just run and kind of walk through these comments together and try to kind of figure out where the group stands on these different comments and try to figure out kind of the best path forward from there. Kirk or Jesse, do you want to mention anything else before I get started? Okay. And then we hope to have a revised draft of this at the next meeting to discuss. Okay. And this should be the document that we sent out last week, and it's also the one that was printed out at the front when you came in today. So it's just the comments that we've received, and we haven't made any changes to the document yet. Okay. So really just, starting at the top. So we received a couple just more general comments. So the first one, in the background and purpose section, be consistent with the settlement text, including current and future water means. Looking back at the settlement, that this is a language that they use, so I guess, this seems pretty straightforward to me, but are there any concerns with that text?
I don't necessarily have a problem with it being consistent with the settlement language, but if that's going to be a goal, then we should make sure we're being all encompassing of that. I know we've had conversations, for example, about how it should address areas that exceed the health-based value for PFAS. I believe there's some language like that in there, so maybe it's worth another look at what the settlement language is to bring that more comprehensively into this document.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, too, that there is other language, and that's actually, so kind of, building off of that, there is additional language in the settlement that talks about prioritizing water supplies where health-based values, health risk limits, and health risk indices are exceeded. So that's another kind of text from the settlement. And then we do also have another criteria related to future needs and conditions, so also, kind of weighing both of those pieces. And I think we can talk about those a little bit more, too. Are there any thoughts on that comment before we move on? I think we can dive into those specific criteria as well once we get there. Okay. So another comment that we received, whether or not is a screening criteria and evaluation criteria, LGU support should be a requirement as it was during the expedited projects. It should be given a high priority. So this is something that we did have pretty active discussion on yesterday, but I'm just curious kind of where you all, or kind of what your thoughts are on this comment, potentially how to address it, what kind of those options are for it.
Carol, do you want to just tie in 1819 and
Yep. Yep, that's a good. So at the end of this document, we do have this list of other criteria. And here we have, so criteria 18, it's specifically that the project is consistent with regional planning. And here we talk about Met Council planning, Washington County planning, regional aquifer planning. 19 is consistent with local planning, such as city comprehensive plans. And then 20 is acceptable to the public. So we did receive some, comments on these criteria as well.
And at that time, the group tended to rank them lower.
Right. Yep. So we did also have a discussion on kind of, the priority of these criteria. And I think also that 19, does, capture some of that kind of local LGU support, but maybe that's, potentially some changes there to capture the thought.
I think it's important we look at 19 and 18 that really has to be a high priority. I mean, you're taking hundreds, if not thousands, of hours worth of work by the Metropolitan Council, all of the communities, Washington County, and the groups that have met for years to develop these plans and strategies, and to then say that they're a low priority, I think is actually a little insulting. So I think it's important that these need to be high priorities because obviously we have put our expertise together, and as a collaborative body of many local units of government, state agencies, and the Metropolitan Council come to an agreement on this. And so to just say they're a low priority doesn't seem appropriate.
Yep, great, thank you. Yeah, and just, a reminder that, so we did come up with this initial priorities based on the survey that we did a while back, that these criteria came out kind of on the lower end of the other criteria, but we also recognize that was a long time ago, and we're now kind of actually, thinking of this. So, this is kind of where we started, but that is one of the comments that we received from a few different people of really having these criteria have a higher priority. So that's consistent with that. Thank you.
I figured this group would see it my way a little more than yesterday, but thank you all. I think Jennifer was spot on, and I appreciate the professional comment there. At the minimum, and I think a lot of the comments yesterday that were maybe contrary to that were from the more rural communities, and it was maybe the folks within the rural component of those communities were feeling like, why should the city have anything to say about 10 or 15 of my neighbors getting together to put a system together? And I get that thinking, but at the end of the day, and again, because I've spent 20 plus years in local government, I would find it insulting if the city at least didn't have the opportunity to be aware what the system was going to be aware to what standard it was being built. I have a hard time believing the state would fund a project that the city was unaware of or didn't have the ability to at least sign off on. And it could just be, I'm comfortable with government and some aren't. And maybe that's part of the difference here. But that was how that conversation went yesterday, but I anticipated this group would want that ability to have your councils have that vote, so.
Yeah, I figured this would just take off.
Well, I guess in response, if we're going to talk about the rural component, I think it's extremely important for the cities and the local units of government to sign off on those. Because if you look at our actual staging and strategic plans of how we actually lay out our MUSA boundaries and how we're going to expand into the future, and also our cost recovery mechanisms of how we actually bring those utilities out to those areas in the long-term solution at full build-out, those discussions are extremely critical because there is an amount of mass there that we attribute to how we collect area charges and bring utilities to there. So if a little neighborhood out in a rural area can just sign on and be able to get a rural water supply when ultimately the city has plans and has strategically aligned its fee structures to get there to supply it, then we've done a detriment to really, I think, our communities in not ensuring that that's compliant with our comp plans and those strategies.
So this topic really went all over the place yesterday, and so one of the things that came up is that is there a difference between what is within the city's jurisdictional limits versus what is not, and if something's in a township but a city may have it in a longer term plan, how is that factored in? So there was some concern about that, I think, from some of the residents that were more rural. And then we also talked a little bit about the difference between consistency with the plan and approval, and in the sense that certainly I think we just have to talk about whether it's criteria or if it's recognition that there's certainly an approval process if something's going in Cottage Grove. There's no way it gets built in Cottage Grove without the city of Cottage Grove signing off on it. And so, but if there's something more that's just towards planning, and does that rank as a high priority just to make sure it's consistent with the plan at this stage, or is that more in the approval process later? And is it better to separate these out from being criteria rather than being criteria being recognition of the local government role in that oversight piece of this? So that became part of the conversation too, and, because then we have the different levels, right? We have city, township, county, and who plays what role, given the location of any given project.
Maybe I just had too much caffeine this morning, so I'll apologize. But when you look at a city, everything comes through our governmental entity to review. If it's an EAW, if it's an EIS, if it's on the planning phase or if it's in the implementation, we're at the table, we're giving that approval and evaluating that. And so I would think it's critically important that cities are at the table, and this ranks as a high priority both in planning and in implementation.
Seems like from the screen, you've got pretty much general agreement at this point.
Anything you want to say more?
Keep in mind that this document is, again, the original intent of this was for evaluation of scenarios. They aren't even, yes, the scenarios are groups of projects, but again, it's this really conceptual, high-level thing, and I think people are already jumping all the way down to, somebody's submitting a project, and that's not really where this is right now. Obviously, it's extrapolating. It probably will be used as some of that criteria, but when you really look at it, it's like this is really right now targeting that really high level to help the state entities kind of sort through their recommendations for where to go with this stuff. So just keeping that in mind.
Fine, but again, looking at the screen, the feedback, the voices, if you want our input, low should go to high.
Just to real quick note, a conversation yesterday, we asked, why didn't we get any comments back from the citizen and business group specifically? These are all from the government 3M work group. And their response was because they thought it was fine. So the lack of comments from them in their minds was support of the current rankings. So whether those comments aren't up there too, those have to be brought into the larger piece. And it was just something that they wanted to make sure was brought forward.
I'll give it to you in a minute. I just wanted to ask, and I thought about this after I had to leave early yesterday, but is there a problem if we reran this questionnaire to everybody? And would that change everything?
Chance.
I know, but based on what we know now compared to what we knew 9 months ago or whenever, I think 19 and 20 would certainly rise in priority if both groups had a chance to reevaluate. But maybe that in itself is a problem.
Because the survey that we sent out last month, it was hoping to kind of get thoughts on the current priorities. So we did try to do that, but then we just received 4 comments back from the work group members.
You get more now. Well, no, you don't get multiple chances on election day. Say, I didn't know that candidate would win. Now I want to have a chance to vote. And silence isn't agreement. Sorry, Kirk, but you can't say, because I didn't give input, that means I concur. I mean, this is an opportunity for input. You're getting input, at least from what I'm hearing here, to avoid the local government planning as a high priority would be really a bad move. I think we can debate 18. We can have a good debate about 18. I think with 19, this was a layup question for me. It went from low to high. We talked about it at our staff level too. It has got to be supported by local planning. It's got to be consistent with our plans. And to have it anything other than high priority is not even imaginable to be realistic to our communities.
So I was just going to add, when this work group first met, I know one of the comments was, can there be flexibility with planning? So maybe 18 and 19 would read, is consistent with some flexibility with regional planning, because I know people were concerned that regional planning would be sort of like a stop, a gate from things progressing, and so that might be a way of wording it differently.
And we encourage you at some point to join the work group if you want to.
I'm actually sitting in the back because I've got a hearing that I have to
pop in and out. I've got a court thing going on, so I apologize that I have to sit back here. I was trying to be as non-disruptive as possible. I would hesitate, I mean, when looking at the criteria, there's only one high criteria that was supported by the initial survey. And it seems overly disruptive to take something that was initially supported as a low and even to have a discussion of having it above every other criteria but one. Because a jump from low to high would leap over a whole range of them. And I think that, as was noted, the consistency with these larger comprehensive plans, given the new data, in and of itself is not, especially given the approval requirement, is not necessarily in and of itself the magic button. I think that and so I personally, and I think Perry Island would be uncomfortable with jumping it all the way to high, although it might make sense to have a conversation about moving it into that medium range. But high just seems like such a huge jump when you consider that there's literally only one other high requirement.
There's a mic right there. I also wonder if anyone has a response to Carla's point, which I think she was trying to directly address here.
Sorry, I don't have a response to Carla's point, but as I sit here and think about it, so comment 20 was mine. And for me, I think that's where I've struggled, from where it went from a low to a high. And maybe there's a way to separate those issues out. And that's what I was trying to get at by that comment. So, you know, the local planning, the comp plans, your ordinances and stuff, initially, again, I gave it a low because we know that those are things we can change if we need to, if more information comes along. But the idea that local government support is not necessary, that obviously really came out for me during the expedited project process. And so I wonder if a way to move this forward would be to try and separate those two ideas. And if perhaps that might make more sense to folks.
Thank you.
That kind of LGBT support and local planning. Yeah, as two separate things.
Now, I'm usually 99% usually in agreement with Carla, but this one here, I guess I would have to disagree, only because in our plans, we have framework, we have criteria, so all of our plans have objectives and criteria, and we have ways that we're going to implement them. We always know that there is flexibility in our plans, and how you're going to get the nuts and bolts on the ground implementation, there will always be flexibility, but you cannot throw out the framework of those plans and those objectives and those criteria. I think we acknowledge that there's flexibility there to actually implement and how they get implemented, but to add it to the actual criteria, I don't think is appropriate in the actual numbering.
Maybe it's time to move on. I think we really appreciate the comments on this topic. Oh, sure.
I think the only other thing I just want to say is that this whole exercise is just a way for us to try to rank and judge and understand these projects. But it doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation as we look at it, any given scenario, as to whether there's showstoppers or if low, high, medium, whatever we put these different things at, if there's something that's a low and there just is a really good reason that that's a bad idea, I mean, we have to be able to have the flexibility to have those conversations, and I think we have that. And so I just want to say that as we go through this process, we'll take all this feedback and think about whether we need to make some adjustments in language or rating or however it is, but when it's all said and done, we're going to have to talk about these scenarios, and we're going to have to identify, major issues, whether it's a plan, whether it's a rural neighborhoods issue with something, whatever it might be. We have to be able to be flexible in all that. So.
Thank you, Jess. All right. Folks, okay, moving on. Thank you for that discussion. Okay, Okay, so third comment, I think this is just more of a general comment. Good process to get feedback. Please make these recommendations as part of final report. So I see this as just really, making it clear on the process that we use and include that in the final report and how we went about doing that. This was a comment that we received during the work group meetings last month, where we have a sentence to say co-trustees may consider other factors in making their final recommendation. And the comment was that if other factors are used, that those should be defined before the evaluation begins. I think that's something that we're still thinking about. If, it seems like there are other factors, so I think this is something we'll just have to get back to at next month. All right. Now moving on to the first criteria. So we have a criteria that says for drinking water supply projects that directly address water supplies where health-based values, health risk limits, and or health risk indices for PFAS are exceeded will be evaluated more favorably. And this is pulling from the language from the settlement that says to prioritize projects related to these water supplies. We did receive some comments on this criteria. I guess for this one, we still did not develop an actual, how we could go about ranking this criteria. So maybe just taking a step back, if you all have thoughts on, generally this criteria and how it may be applicable at the scenario level. So again, we're going to be thinking of, multiple projects within this scenario. And I think the thought is that, all of those, at a minimum, all of those projects will, our scenario will be addressing all wells above health-based values, so how we kind of think about this at that level. And I think, one of the things that we're really struggling with how to come up with some ranking for this.
It's on now. I mentioned this yesterday. In last month's meeting, we had a little workshop that we were supposed to work on to kind of look at that big long list of projects and say, hey, you look good or not, are we missing something? And basically the recommendation from both meetings was, hey, each LGU should get together and really review it. Well, we did that in Oakdale. And actually, I have, you can't read it, you can hardly read it if you're right here, but I actually put together a spreadsheet with the help of some of my 3M friends that we have used to evaluate projects. When we looked at this one, it really came down to, these other ones have the plus, zero, minus thing. When I looked at that one, what it really came down to, the plus was, hey, it addresses PFAS, I called it exceedance. It's whatever health value, whatever. The middle value I put down addresses PFAS undervalues. It's detected, but it's under those values. And then the lowest thing, the minus, I had no PFAS detected. And again, I didn't try to say anything about, again, that whole thing about detection or not, but that was kind of the ranking that we put in there. And again, that would give the weighting for, okay, and again, the whole charge is, hey, if we know we're over, we better do something about it, so it heavily weighted it. The other part of this, on the priority, I put like a priority of just a nominal number because I wanted to have numbers to come out. I put a 50 on the high. The mediums I weighted with a 10, and those few that were at low, I put a 5 as the multiplier for those scores. And that seemed to be a way to get that ranking, again, for that very first project, to really give that a super high weighting. That, yes, we're still acknowledging the importance of, if we have any detection, doing something about it, but it really weighted the thing of, hey, if we know we're over, this really drives some of this stuff moving forward.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Monica, just, I think one thing that I've been thinking about with this is that, for a scenario, we'll be thinking of, multiple projects.
Right.
So how that kind of can get rolled up to that kind of that next level of when you have, thinking of projects that, that some may be above, some may be below, and how you then develop your ranking for that. Or even,
Well,
if you do.
that's where it gets tough, because again, the first cut use of this whole thing is going to be at the scenario level. So of course it's going to be dealing with stuff that's over. So I mean that weighting is going to show up. So it's back to all these other factors that come into play that start giving you a little bit of differentiation for what scenarios are really going to be effective or not. So, I mean, it's kind of one of those things. When you get down to the actual project level, then I think it's gonna probably make more of a difference. But at the scenario level, I can't imagine scenarios where you wouldn't be doing the stuff that's over. I mean, that is the primary purpose of this whole effort. While I've got the mic, one other comment about this thing about the local, consistent with local planning and stuff. Interestingly, there could be a pretty detailed master plan for where you want to go with water supply, drinking water supply, and so forth throughout these communities. But part of the whole purpose of these work groups is, hey, here's some thoughts that may not have occurred to local entities before. Like some of these small rural systems, stuff like that. Some of this stuff may not have even occurred to people. They were just thinking of, a big, massive city structure for dealing with some of this stuff. So I think you got to keep that in mind. Some of the comp plans may have been put together, because that work was done a bit ago. Some of the comp plans, and I don't know the level of detail that some of that stuff is in there, but some of these thoughts on like a big centralized treatment system, whatever, may not have occurred to some of the communities involved in this effort. So some of this stuff, we may have had pretty good plans thinking forward, and that's a good thing, but some of these options may not have occurred to people as they did the plans. So to me, that's why that consistency thing, I think that's why we picked those words in the first place. And it wasn't so much, yes, as projects go forward, they certainly need to go through an approval process with the entities, but some of this was, hey, did you even know you had some of these other options to consider?
So, as we looked at it, pretty tough to argue with number one at all. The thing we wanted just to make sure this group constantly has on its mind is the future. So we know what we know now. We don't know what the future looks like. We don't know what the future health indices will be. We don't know how the plume is going to migrate. We don't know how cancer research is going to evolve. So the thing we want to make sure, when we're all said and done, our plan and our actions work today, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years into the future. So while number one is just so clear and easy and high, it's important that we don't forget the future in evaluating and pursuing issues today. So that was the thing that's on our mind. It's flu season. Many of us are getting flu shots. We want to make sure we're protected, preventative. It has social benefits. And we also want to make sure that whoever wants a flu shot can get a flu shot, that we're not creating disparities and inequities. So the same thing is going to be with water. Water gets really at the core of this whole equity conversations, and we just have to make sure whatever system we come up with, people are not walking away feeling that there are base inequities because of today's situation, and they're left in a more vulnerable position. So just be thinking about vulnerabilities, think about the future. Obviously, number one is high, but we can't so pursue number one that we don't protect vulnerable, threatened systems that maybe don't hit current today's levels.
Which is why we have some other questions addressing those.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you, Clint.
So I kind of agreed with what Monica said, but then when I heard Terrell talk, it changed my mind a little bit. So I wonder if at the scenario level, it's not as simple as a pass-fail for this. And then as we get down to the projects, I don't necessarily agree with your 50, 10, and 5, but that idea of it being separated the way you explained, I think maybe makes sense at the project level. And maybe at the higher scenario level, it's probably just a pass-fail, and probably all your scenarios are going to pass anyways. So it's maybe, I don't know, it's an important criteria, but I'm struggling to see how it fits in at the scenario level, because I guess I just take that as a given.
I guess the question that's been in my mind as earlier Terrell was talking about the process with the trustees, going through and evaluating the scenarios based on these criteria that have been put together. And that's a scenario is whatever it is, 10 or 20 projects put together across all the cities. I guess my question is, okay, so that is done and the trustees have ranked things good, better, and best. Then what happens? Then what's the role of cities after that?
You want to address this? You guys want to flip a coin?
Well, I think it goes back to the issue that talked a little bit earlier, Jess had mentioned that, and we've said in other meetings, is that the state can impose something that the cities are vehemently against. And just like the cities can't move forward with something the state's vehemently against. And so while this is a good formula and I think is really going to wait out some of that, ultimately it still comes down to that ability to have the cities be comfortable with what's moving forward. How you put this in the formula, I think, is where we all have the tricky part. Is it something outside the formula, because it is kind of its own question in and of itself, or is it something in the formula and it's one piece of 20, or is it really kind of something on the outside where it's its own standalone piece? And I don't know if that helped answer the question in terms of how it fits in here. We've had that, we've mentioned it here a couple times. Maybe it does sit outside on its own pedestal or own process, because it is not really one of 20. It's such a key component to it also. Does that help?
And Kirk, building off of that then, once this plan is finalized, then it'll be actually moving to implementing the projects, and that's likely going to be like the cities or other entities that are actually doing the implementation, with the state kind of signing off on the funding. I think that's our thoughts for that.
Well, I guess my question still is, I'm looking for more detail, or I guess more detail on what the role will be, or what the process is going to be after the trustees do their evaluation and they come back with, okay, this is the best scenario that we believe serves all cities the best. Then that comes, now the cities all get to see that, and then what? Then is there a process where there is discussion about that, and how did how did that come up and we see it a little different, or how is that process? Is there a process for that?
I'll help you beat up on the state. It's okay.
So I don't think we've got it well defined, but yes, that's what has to occur, right? So let's say that we get to we think along with our consultants that scenario Z is the best one, and it's the thing that's going to be perfect for everybody. And we're not just going to go and implement that. We need to go through and find out, okay, what are we not thinking about here? Can it be implemented? What do you think the pitfalls are that we're not paying attention to? And we have to go through that conversation, and then at some point, it'll be kumbaya, and we're all going to be together, and we're going to say, this is the way to go. Maybe not. I think what we need to recognize, though, is at some point, there's going to be decisions we have to make collectively, and then we have to make as trustees as to trade-offs and, what are deal breakers and what aren't. And I think it gets to this, we talked, yesterday, equity came up, for example. At some point, as we're talking through scenarios, if we're talking about dollars and equity and all these types of things, where are we going to give? Are we going to give on O&M, or are we going to give on everybody having just the same treated water regardless of the levels in the area? And so I think that all comes in to these discussions. But I can't point to a slide that says, here's exactly how we're going to do it. But I think we're guaranteeing that we have to have those conversations. I mean, obviously, we have to have those conversations for sure.
Maybe this helps it. Part of what I hear him asking and you answering is, there is a provision for some independent conversations with specific LGUs that have specific concerns and ultimately a large group conversation. Is that, I'm trying to help get to the concrete.
Yeah. So here's an example that we talked about in the scenario. There are some scenarios, which is maybe the city's one city's number one, or community's number one scenario, and it interacts with another community. But it's that second community's second or third choice. And we've been tussling with this as we run these through the scenarios. And if it comes back through here, it makes sense. And, the first city's like, yep, that's our number one choice. And the other city says, it's a no-go for us. The formula's not going to be able to perfectly pull that out. That's where those conversations Jess is talking about has to happen. There isn't, I know we would like a great checklist, this is exactly it, but this is a guide, and that to have those conversations, it can't solve everything. And I think, to Jess's point, we realize how critical the local units of government's part is in here, that those conversations will be had.
And just to build off what Milt said then too, is that it'd be ideal if we could all sit down, we could all figure this out together, but we recognize that might not be the only way to do it. And we might need to have not only big group discussions to see if we can understand each other and come to some agreement, but we might need to have individual community discussions too, just to be able to talk candidly about, concerns about the proposed scenarios or proposed projects. And so I think that all has to be in the mix on that process end.
Does that help? Sorry, I didn't want more.
Not in this context.
Okay. All right. Given time, we should probably move on to some of the other comments. So maybe we'll go to kind of some of the more meatier ones, but if I do skip over one, or if you have other comments, let me know. But another one that we had some pretty active discussion on yesterday was around criteria number 7. So we received comments from 2 different people that talked about that this should be split up. So having one criteria related more towards population growth as its own, and then having another criteria that then captures some of the other thoughts, such as new contaminants, movement of contaminants, change in health-based values, and climate change impacts. I think the thought was that this was trying to capture a little bit too much stuff into one criteria. So curious how folks, think about that split, and then also curious of, the kind of the priorities, if we did split them up, kind of if those would still have the same priority or different priorities. And I think there was one comment where the population growth should be a low priority and the other criteria related to contaminants should be a medium priority.
I definitely agree with the comments that it should be split, because I think when we look at population and future growth, it's a very different animal than dealing with new contaminants in the actual plume. So I think those are 2 very different factors. What I'm struggling with, though, and how to prioritize those is under your implementation criteria, everything is essentially a medium. And so, trying to weigh them against one another, my first instinct is, well, man, I want that high. But at the same time, you've actually created everything in the medium medium category. So if you were to look at that, I would say the future needs then would stay medium to stay consistent with how you've identified such as number 5 in a medium. But then I would move the new contaminants and the movement of it to a lower priority. But I guess that's one of my other questions is you have so many of them all in medium. Is anything actually going to differentiate itself or actually fall out of the criteria of how you've prioritized because everything is staying relatively the same in the medium bucket?
So I had not too.
Thank you.
Back to our Oakdale evaluation. I was surprised at the spread we had. Bart, myself, and Brian, who's our superintendent, the engineer for our systems. I was surprised at the spread we had for how we evaluated just the Oakdale, the projects that were listed for Oakdale. And it's kind of back to that thing about they are all going to come out the same is basically what it comes down to. And all of this needs discussion. All this is doing is giving us a framework to decide, like all the way down at the bottom, we had that whole thing about, the public response to it. Is the public going to really like it? Some of these equity things. It was amazing the spread we had. And like I said, sometimes you'll have something to, all of them needing to address a certain object, but again, that's the point of having this longer list of things to take into consideration. It's still interesting to try and think of other factors, and maybe other factors are splitting some of these out separately and distinctly. That might be some of the tactic they take, but again, this it's going to be interesting trying to apply it at, again, the high scenario level, the individual projects, and then getting really down into the meat of some of these solutions that we're looking at.
And I think that's what we're looking for, is what other ones, we recognize so many are in that middle category. Are there ones that, should be elevated? Some of these, like number 3, hopefully every project has a high probability of success. And so, some of those are, and I think that's probably what happened on your run through it, is so many of them, they all met certain categories that all of a sudden it really was 3 or 4 categories that made the difference because there was a differential between them.
Jennifer, I just wanted to circle back to your comment. So I think, did you say that around the priorities that you thought the kind of the population growth should stay at a medium and the new contaminants should be low? Is that what you were thinking, or just kind of general?
In the context of how everything else has been rated, subject to the other one so that they're in equal weight. I think it's important, because when we look at the future needs, most of us, sorry, Oakdale, but, are built out. The rest of us are growing, and so we can't be making decisions with so much growth on our horizons, and how can you negate that or say that that's not important? So I think it's important that we do have an eye to the future and the needs, and it doesn't eliminate a solution for the future and to be short-sighted in that. So I think it has to be a high priority, but it's hard when you weigh number 5 against it, when I would say, yeah, then it needs to be the same consistency with medium. Number 8, since I have the mic, I don't fully understand what 8 is, but that may be something that you move to a lower priority.
So I guess another one where I'm struggling with what we mean by future needs. I think as I had mentioned at the last one, if in my mind if future needs is new development, that should be paid for by developers. And so that's why I guess I would respectfully disagree with Jennifer if that's the way it's interpreted, and say that should be given a low priority for that reason, that we shouldn't be supplementing future growth that way.
That is a good clarification. absolutely, we always stand on the fact that development pays for itself. I guess when I was thinking about the future needs, it's maybe a sizing of a water treatment plant or the size of the water main that's coming out of it, that we're not being short-sighted in how we design it, because I absolutely agree development should pay for itself.
Any other thoughts on this?
I guess my thought about, okay, there are a lot of medium ranked elements, but I guess my thought, and we're trying to, I guess, differentiate between projects, but if we get a number of projects that we can all say they are a plus on provides long-term benefits, provides multiple benefits, addresses future needs, has low risk of adverse impacts. If we have multiple projects that we're trying to pick from, and we only get a plus on all of those, it tells me well, we've got a lot of good projects. Then we just get to pick among a number of good projects. So I don't see that as such a problem.
All right, maybe moving on. Thank you for those thoughts. That helps a lot. Okay. So I think, Jennifer, you did have a question about number 8. I think here we were thinking, and there's also a comment about this one. I think here we were thinking that it was, so for some of the remedial actions, such as those done under the consent order, or if there's other kind of known remedies in the area, that whatever project is chosen, that won't have a negative effect on those remedial actions. So I think that's where we're going with it, but maybe kind of, rethinking that priority. Makes sense?
Yeah, so an example is, I don't even know, Gary can tell me how theoretical this is actually possible, but if we put some wells next to the pump-out wells around one of the disposal sites and it interferes with it and starts making that non-effective, that's what we don't want to do. So we don't want to do something that inadvertently. Is that a good example, Gary? Good enough?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can work on the wording to make that clear on what that is. I think it was just also confusing as written. All right. So another criteria that we received some comments on was number 9. So originally we had this set as not applicable at the scenario level, but there are some thoughts that this should be applicable, that there could be the potential for adverse or kind of differences in risk depending on what the option is. So really considering that in this evaluation process, and probably Carla or Lucas can. And there is, some information about some of these potential risks depending on that.
So we talked about this yesterday briefly, and I spoke up, and I tend to focus on public water supplies and what those, balancing those risks. But private wells have their own risks. So, people, less than 19% of well owners test their wells for 5 contaminants. There are 100 plus contaminants that get tested for at public water systems. So we've talked about doing sort of a comparison as to what are your health risks associated with both private wells and public water systems. So I just wanted to point that out, that private wells, they have their own risks.
Are there any concerns with making this criteria applicable? Oh, yep. Yep, sorry. So it has low risk of unintended adverse health impacts, and Carla and Lucas could probably talk about this more, but I think, if you're changing a water supply, that there could be changes in the water quality, so changes in the corrosiveness, or if you're disinfecting, there could be disinfection byproducts.
Yeah, no, I agree. It should be on, we looked at this idea of mixing a fair amount, because we're right next to the same city, St. Paul, and could pretty easily receive their water, so we looked into it. And we've been educated now to the challenges of taking a system that was groundwater-based and then introducing surface water to the piping system, to the mechanical systems, the challenges of a consistent water quality when you're mixing groundwater and surface water, the technical challenges, the operational challenges, the dual systems. It sounds kind of good, until you really get into it. And then you quickly learn there's a lot of complexities. So that really resulted in us deciding that we don't want to have any solutions that does have inadvertent, unintended health impacts like, again, that question of introducing surface water with a groundwater system mixing and or even just wholesale changing, because there are some challenges that come into play with that.
I would definitely second what Clint has said, because I think, as governmental entities, it's our obligation to ensure that there isn't those adverse health impacts and some of those unintended consequences. Just look at Flint, Michigan. It's not something that you would want to have, and it should be a criteria that we're evaluating that, and it gets into the mix.
Great, thanks. All right. Any other comments on that one? One of the more straightforward ones. Okay, so number 11, we received, for this criteria, we had minimizes adverse social impacts. We received a comment, failing to equitably treat all potable water within the affected area would result in untenable disparities among neighborhoods related to health risks. And I think we talked a little bit about this already, but maybe we just want to circle back to this and, if there's thoughts about kind of this concept related to the criteria.
Can I just add something to it, please?
Yeah, please.
So, to me, this is that equity one, and I asked this question yesterday too, is maybe folks can help define what you mean when you talk about equity. The word equity came up again yesterday, and the scenario I put out there is that if there's, if you have an area that is above health-based values, certainly you want to do something. If there's an area that has detect, not above health-based values, and then we have areas that have no detect. Does equity mean everyone, regardless of detect? Does equity mean everyone who has had some detect? Or does equity mean sizing, as Jennifer talked about, systems to be able to handle future needs? And so just maybe getting some clarification on that would be helpful.
Thank you for the context.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting for someone else to speak.
He just knew I needed more reference.
When I like Stephen Covey, and he always says, begin with the end in mind. So when I think 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, what would be the hardest thing for me professionally would be to have been a part of a system design that, while maybe providing capacity, did things that did not protect people. And I think we're still in such an evolutionary, evolving area. So while we have to hang our hat on exceedances and we have to address those, we do need to really understand that the number 10, 20, 30 years from now could be completely different. The science could be completely different. How that plume migrates could really surprise us. We, 11 years ago, didn't have a well that was impacted by PFAS. Now we have 7. So things are really dynamic. In a dynamic environment, that's where this aspect of, if things were solid and stable, and it is what it is, and we know the science for the future, and we know where that plume is going, absolutely, let's just, stop and hold and then build capacity. But in a very dynamic situation, where consumer confidence is crucial, where we're seeing communities get torn apart by the haves and the have-nots. And I think some residents aren't going to give a darn about what their PFAS number is. They want to know, is my family protected? Can I be assured that that water I'm drinking is safe? You're saying it's safe now. How do I know it's safe in a year from now, into the future? I don't want to face, and I hope this group doesn't want to face, people who are going to feel that they don't get that treatment, that someone across the way does, because of a number that's based on today's results. So that's why we have a fair degree of concern and emphasis to equity. And we've been watching a lot of other communities go through these equity battles, and it may be on police issues, it may be on social justice issues, it may be on financial issues. We can't ignore that water and the provision of water and the knowledge that that water is safe is just as much a part of the equity conversations as all the other things that communities are dealing with. So this is high on our radar screen, and we don't want to create disparities that end up coming back to bite us, that all of a sudden we have to do quick system extensions to deal with. Thank you.
Anyone else? I think Bill. Yeah, I think Clint probably just described it quite well, but and I don't have any specific examples in mind here, but the worst scenario I could think of would be, let's say a community had a lower income, multi-unit housing area, but it wasn't slated, in their long-term plan, it was more intended, that'll be commercial, industrial at some point, or something along that lines, but it's going to phase out over time. We're going to get, it won't be residential forever, that kind of thing. But right now, it's a low-income, affordable housing for young families, that kind of thing. But we decide, for whatever reason, in the development plans, that we're going to concentrate our effort on putting new extension of water to a different area, and it would be a poor investment to serve that area. That would be clearly a poor choice in terms of equity and disadvantaged population, that kind of thing, thinking that the current residential, and because those individuals that live there might be there for quite some time to come yet, until that plan was realized or something. That's what I'm thinking of when I see this. We just want to avoid those kinds of circumstances where somebody is overlooked, or there's not a consideration, at least if that's the decision, consideration of how to, in the interim, serve that community or something like that. But those would be the kinds of things that come to mind for me in terms of equity and health equity.
So I hear a couple things in there. One is the high level of concern, of uncertainty, of the knowledge of what are the health-based values today and tomorrow, and plume stability, which is part of 7, which would be new contaminants, changing health values, climate change. Is that the concern, or is it that everyone needs to be treated? And an example I'll use is some communities, and I don't know if those within the East Metro here, will have some wells for non-arsenic, natural occurring things, arsenic, manganese, that where some over a hurl, if they have 10 wells, 3 are over a hurl, the others it's not over a hurl, but they only treat the ones over the hurl. And that's done across a number of communities, or is it just the presence of the contaminant? Because the concern is, if we set a precedent that just because it shows up, then for equity reasons, that has to be the same thing. So put in nitrates, arsenic, manganese, in place of PFAS, is that same standard going to be held equity, or is it because of the uncertainty of the changing values in the plume? What is it really the driver of that conversation to know where to put the biggest weight? I think I hear it's more the uncertainty of PFAS, the values, and the plume, but I just want to make sure that I understand what that what that is. And maybe there is no difference. Maybe that's an artificial difference I've created in my own mind.
Stumped them. Thank you, Monica.
To get to Clint's point about, we should treat every drop of water, maybe that's a scenario that our friends at Wood put together. What if we treated every drop of water pumped out? What would that cost? To me, that's one of the, there's that whole thing about balancing available dollars, both for the capital projects and for the O&M, and maybe that's a scenario we should request. What if we treated every drop of water that's pumped, regardless of if it's a private well, a neighborhood well, all the way up to what I call the city systems? But Brian's shaking his head. That's kind of what this conversation is about, to get to the point of the Woodbury equity discussion of, well, does that mean we have to treat every drop of water that's moved in a system, regardless of scale, private all the way up to those bigger systems? Maybe that's how we at least get some kind of data to better inform our recommendations.
And what it does, too, is it creates a resilience. So let's just say we stop at exceedance, all right? And we don't extend water because it doesn't exceed. And then 10 years down the road, we learned, the plume migrated. It's this area that didn't exceed today now exceeds later. And when we had the chance to build the system to protect, to deal with this, we didn't, because we were focused on today's plume, today's standard, and we hadn't given a thought to tomorrow. I think that's a pretty damning prospect. And I don't want to face that I just stopped at exceedance, and the pipe didn't go any further, and the treatment didn't go any further because we're so focused on today. We do a lot in our community about resilience. I think we all do things to prepare for emergencies. Think about the what-ifs, and what do we have to have in terms of equipment and procedures to deal with things as they change. I think this water approach has got to do the same thing. It's got to think, we know so much today, we're going to know more 10 years from now, 20 years from now. We've got to make sure the system and how we allocate these monies creates a resiliency and an equity and a better surety than we have today, because there's a lot, and I think the drumbeat on PFAS, from everything I'm reading, I'm hardly the scientist, but everything I'm reading is the drumbeat on this issue is getting louder, and it's getting more significant. So that's why, back to what you said, Monica, I think that's got to be part of the plan. I understand it's more expensive. At the end of the day, we do not have to deal with the what-ifs, the should we have looked down the road. Have we split our neighborhoods? Have we divided areas that have less concentrations of wealth from places that have concentrations of wealth? I think we'll have peace of mind, and sometimes we do things for the frank aspect of peace of mind. I have life insurance, I'm in great health, but I have life insurance because I want peace of mind, And I do that, and I pay that price today to have peace of mind for my family. Thank you.
Just following up on that and on Monica's comment too, and this going to this concept then of balancing that decision of how far do you go with O&M costs and how are those covered. And we've heard from some communities that you'd be comfortable with not the community being responsible for future O&M and covering that and not having it come from the settlement. But I wanted to get a gauge if that's a universal feeling within the local governments, or if it's all over the board, or where we're at on that.
Depends on what the solution is.
Yeah.
if you're gonna make me go with an expensive surface water, then no, I want that covered, but if it's just wells, maybe it's something we're willing to take on.
Fair enough. The other comment that came up too, and I'll leave this hanging out there too, is yesterday when we were talking about this, one of the citizen members said, it was kind of wrapped up in this equity and O&M conversation combined. And the citizen member said, well, so then what's my water bill going to be if I don't have any PFAS, but now I have to be hooked up because we have to have equity, so what's my water bill? Are you going to analyze that, or are you going to be able to tell me that at the public meeting? And so these are all the things I think we need to weigh a little bit and put into the equation of the conversation at some point.
Oh, Carla. I got it.
So one of the things we struggle with at the health department is also it's health equity, and a lot of it's related to cost of service. So what we see, one of the reasons that a lot of utilities don't go to no detects for nitrates, arsenic, radionuclides, is that it becomes much more expensive to treat for O&M. But what some utilities do is they have set aside a reserve fund for low-income residents, so that if it does become very expensive, there's sort of a resource for those that need that additional health equity. So.
Okay, we are real similar in our timeline to where we were at yesterday. There are a few more comments that Tara wants to run by you, and our folks at Wood did an amazing job of accommodating the schedule, but you're over halfway through the morning. Can we go ahead and take a 10-minute break now and let you take care of needs, and we'll be back here at 10:51.
All right, so we just wanted to spend a little bit more time on this document. So I went through it again at the break, and I feel like we've talked about most of the meatier comments. Were there any other comments that you saw in this document that you wanted to talk about? Or are there other things, after you're kind of looking through the comments in the document, of things you wanted to raise? Any kind of thoughts on changes or concerns with any of the language or clarification? And I was just saying that I looked through the comments and I didn't really see any kind of additional ones that I felt like we needed to talk about, but I wanted to throw that out to the group to see if there's anything else, other comments to circle back to, or other thoughts. Anyone? Hearing none? Okay. All right. So our plan is to take the feedback that we heard today. Thank you for that. The comments that we received and the feedback that we heard yesterday, and try to refine this document to address those concerns. And then we'll be circulating a revised draft before next work group meeting, and we'll be talking about those changes at our November meeting. So kind of have another chance to see this again. Any other questions there? All right. Thanks again for the discussion.
We'd like to, somewhere toward the middle of the meeting, check in with the members of the public to see if there are any questions or comments. I don't even know if we have folks that are here as a member of the public or not, but I saw some people shaking their heads no. So, okay, thank you.
I'm going to go a little off script here because I didn't have enough coffee at the beginning to ask this question. Yes. So related to the email that had gone out to us last week, and there was some mention about some of the projects that have been approved by various cities. And I know that a couple of us have really struggled with the fact that some of this stuff is private data. And I wonder if either of the agencies are going to consider a legislative change next year so that we could get an exemption for this group similar to the Arts Board, so that in the future we can be more open and transparent and have these conversations with our residents. And I don't know how anybody else in the group feels about that, but a couple of us have talked, and it's really a challenge for us. And we've really, I thought from the beginning, pushed this open and transparent conversation that we could have. And once that hit this summer, it really threw a wrench in the works and created some issues in some of our communities. And I just want to bring that up and see if the agency might do something about that.
Sure, we can think about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some of these same debates internally. I think we've talked to our public data folks and our contracting and attorneys and admin more than I think we wanted to through this whole process to try to find that balance. Seeing how it impacts all the other areas, the idea of a carve-out just for this process, and it was something we talked a little bit about, and we can talk about some more. But you're right. I mean, this is a struggle for us, and wanting to be able to provide that open, transparent process. I know it's a struggle for the applicants in this process. We've heard from a number of them in the local units of government. The reason we sent out the list, between the meetings, we had one of the Citizen Business Work Group members email us and said, hey, I saw a mayor sent out that they got awarded this expired project. Can you comment on it? And we couldn't confirm nor deny, but it's pretty much out there. So what we just tried to do is like a news clippings, just pulled together what was out there on the public notices, because local units of government have to have that public process that has to go through there. So I think it's definitely something we want to have more conversations about.
The precedence with the Art Board carve-out, that's why I mention it.
There's other precedents too. I mean, there's certain activities within state government where the commissioner has the discretion to make something public if it furthers a discussion that's necessary as part of that review. And for example, appraisal data, when we're talking about public lands, and if we're working with another state agency, we can't technically share appraisal data unless the commissioner makes a designation that it's okay to make it public for that purpose. So there is other precedents. I think it's definitely worth looking into, seeing how we could structure something like that.
I would just echo those comments. We did have a number of residents that expressed frustration because either they drilled a well not knowing, or they had undertaken well activity that cost them money financially, and they were quite disturbed, specifically one that we had, issued a building permit for them to drill a private well, but we were obviously under the obligation to be confidential, and so we honored that, but knowing that we may have done a disservice to some of our residents in that process, and they did kind of hit us up as to why we weren't transparent and honest with that dialogue and those upcoming projects. So I think it would be better for our public interest and transparency in the process not to have that confidentiality agreement in there.
Thank you.
Okay, should we turn to Wood?
All right, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Erin Doherty. I'm with Wood. I just kind of wanted to go over briefly kind of a quick update, and then I'll turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk about our steps moving forward. So a little bit of this is going to be repeated from our last meeting. And we got some really good feedback from the work groups about how we've gotten to this point and how we've come up with some of these, or all of our conceptual projects, and how we've reached the final conceptual project list. So this was a slide that was in our last presentation, just about how we came up with the list and our sources of input being mostly work group members and meetings with LGUs, and also the public. So we did put together a finalized list of the conceptual projects. It has been made available on the SharePoint. And just as a quick check, has there been anybody that's had issues with SharePoint and accessing the list or the memos? That's really great. Oh, have you still been having issues? Oh.
Yeah, I've had issues for months, so I just get
Okay, maybe we can talk afterwards, because we'd like to get those fixed. But there are updated memos on the SharePoint site as well as the final conceptual project list. So I'll go over these in a little bit more in detail, but we did get some great feedback about some of the issues that we had in the list in terms of duplicates. Maybe there were some other grammatical errors or things that we just needed to clarify. So we did take all those into account, including any comments that were submitted via the email. So we have incorporated those. You'll see if you go into the spreadsheet that there are additional tabs that we have shown there, and I'll walk through those briefly. To kind of summarize really quickly, we didn't delete, I shouldn't say that. We removed duplicate projects from the master list, but we kind of saved them in a separate tab so that they're still visible. And I'll go over what those included. And we had 2 new projects that were submitted via email to address the non-community public water systems as well as the wells inside county parks. So those got put on the list as well. So we did include a complete list of the expedited projects, just kind of more as a form of tracking and show what has actually been submitted. We kind of wanted a place to keep all of this information that we've been receiving, including online submittals and the expedited projects that were submitted. So that tab will give you a complete list of the expedited projects. The Remove Duplicates tab is where we have taken all the duplicates from the master list and placed them, so we did not delete them, they're there. The intent of removing the duplicates was in response to the feedback for unique projects, so we really wanted to just keep the unique projects on the master list. And our preference was to keep the projects that had been submitted by workgroup members or by members of the public on the master list. So, for example, say there was a submitted project, but it kind of overlapped with one of the projects that was in the conceptual project memo. We preferred to take the project that was in the memo out so that we're representing the feedback and the submitted projects that we were receiving. There may have been a case that a submitted project covered 1 or more, so 2 or more projects from the memo, in which case we kept those as separate projects and then removed the submitted project as the duplicate, just in an effort to really keep the unique projects on the list. We also had comments that we tracked on the list as well. We tried to address all of these comments. I realized there was a little bit of a mix-up in how we had numbered those, so we did our best to really reconcile the comments with the list and address all of those. So in doing so, we came up with the final CP list. And I know last time we had shown this breakdown, which at the time was a little convoluted just because of how those projects, there were duplicates and stuff. But after removing them, we came up with a total of 103 projects. A couple of those I know in the past we talked about we weren't sure fit with the priority 1 objectives. So there were a couple of those others that didn't really quite fit into our categories, but we'll see for the most part we have all the individual projects by community, but there were a lot that involved multiple communities, which in cases looked at the interconnect possibilities as well as regional projects. So you'll see that breakdown, as well as our project sources, which primarily were from what was submitted online and what we had developed in those conceptual project memos. And lastly, the last pie chart on here looks at the scale. So we're looking at everything down from individual wells, so whether that's residential wells or other establishments, all the way up to regional, like East Metro-wide projects. So just kind of gives you a summary about what was on the list. Did anybody have any comments or anything regarding the list? And I don't know if anybody's had another chance to look through it. So, okay. So it's kind of just a brief update. Brian's going to go over our process.
All right, thank you, Erin. So now that we've gotten through the kind of conceptual project list and kind of that phase of this project, there's about 100 of those total. And that's really our bucket of projects and potential projects that we're drawing from to create these individual scenarios. We have 4 scenario groupings we're considering. The first one is community specific, more of a regional. Then the next one is a regional.
Group 3 is a treatment, which is basically treating the existing wells. And then Group 4 is an integrated scenario, which will probably draw from some of the projects and ideas that are developed in the first 3. Into a little bit more detail, we have kind of nailed down the different iterations or alternatives in each one of these scenarios that we're going to consider. The first one is a community-specific. These consist of the projects that were submitted by the individual LGUs, and we've been meeting with the LGUs this week to clarify those, make sure we have those accurate. So then we'll have one scenario that includes all the projects that the individual LGUs want to see. So we'll cost them out, see what that looks like. If there's any overlap between those projects, then we'll just look at another iteration, for that individual community. And then when it comes to the regional supply, we're looking at both surface water only solutions. So in those cases, it's going to be only surface water. We're not looking at blending surface water and groundwater. And then we also have a groundwater only solution. For the surface water, we're looking at basically one surface water plant on the Mississippi that would feed all 14 communities. The next alternative we'll be considering will be one on the Mississippi, one on the St. Croix. A third one will be looking at St. Paul Regional Water System, extending that out to maybe feed the west side of the area, and then having another plant on the St. Croix to feed that side. When it comes to groundwater, we want to look at kind of 2 possibilities. One is if we just turn off all the existing municipal wells in the area, is there a place within the East Metro area where we can get clean water that can serve everybody? So we don't have to have treatment for that water. It's about 50 million gallons per day or so is what we're looking at. Is that sustainable? Is that available? Is that a possibility? That's where we'll be relying heavily on the groundwater model to tell us that. The next one would be looking at maybe 2 or 3 different well fields scattered throughout all 14 areas that could feed multiple communities. And then where it makes sense, kind of some of the rural areas where it doesn't make sense to send out water lines to connect them to the city system, we'd keep those people on POETs, which is basically an individual, GAC type system. When it comes to the treatment scenarios, this is what we call kind of the status quo, where we don't have to do a lot of infrastructure. We're just looking at installing treatment systems on existing wells. We have 4 different scenarios we'll be considering. And this is looking at just the number of wells that will receive a treatment plant. This isn't considering kind of the level of treatment each one of those wells. So for all wells that have that are above the HI of greater than 0, what does that cost look like? That could be 2,000 wells in the area. That would have the highest cost. Then the next iteration will be looking at just wells that have PFOS, PFO, or PFHXS. That's kind of to eliminate the wells that just have PFBA in them, because that's, pretty, that's throughout the whole area already. The next one would be looking at the health index greater than 0.5. So maybe that's, 1,000 wells, and what's the cost to treat just those wells, both private and municipal. And then the third iteration is just treating the ones that are greater than 1. And then for each one of those 4, we're going to look at, 2020 water demands for GAC. What's also the cost for ion exchange? And then we'll look at 2040 water demands for GAC and also ion exchange. So between all those, I think options and alternatives should really give a good overview of what the possibilities are. And then the last scenario grouping will be the integrated.
Just real quick.
Yes.
We mentioned early on in the meeting the idea of, what wells to treat, if it's all wells or that, or all wells with PFAS detection, and we said we'd come back to a conversation about the PFBA and the difference between that and PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS that Brian highlighted. We want to make some time, too, for Department of Health just to talk about some of the differences on what that means when we talk about non-detect and how that goes through the treatment systems, too. And it was a useful conversation yesterday, and I'm going to turn this over to Lucas real quick just to touch base on that.
I warned you.
Yeah, hi. So with regards to PFBA, some of the discussion yesterday was how to treat that and whether we should be treating to, like you're talking about, non-detect levels of all of these PFAS compounds, or if we treat some of them differently. And so PFBA is a little bit of a different situation than some of the others because it is more difficult to treat and remove from water. It's a much smaller compound, so it breaks through carbon very quickly. So if you're targeting PFBA to treat that and remove it, you're really talking about much higher operations costs because you're going to be changing carbon out much more frequently. That's not typically something that we're doing right now is targeting PFBA. We're looking at more of the other compounds that have much lower health-based values when we're talking about changing carbon out and when to do that. So that would be a much different scenario with regards to O&M costs of how you're treating and how you're targeting removal and whether you're talking about non-detect for and consistently maintaining that in your treated water. So, so that was, I think, part of the discussion yesterday, right, Kirk, that I offered some clarification on. Did I miss anything?
I think it's just that difference between being able to get to non-detect for certain compounds, or if we put treatment on the health-based drinking water advisories are being driven by PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS. None of them are driven by PFBA.
Right.
PFBA is also found in other parts of the state outside the East Metro, but we don't have necessarily concerns. So when we talk about, detection levels or treat anything with PFAS, we just want to pull out this distinction because I think as we run through these scenarios, it's going to have a big impact for the reasons that Lucas mentioned and Carly.
Yeah, and I'll just add that PFBA is ubiquitous. I mean, you can find it in a lot of different places throughout the world. So that's why we don't use that as sort of a treatment objective. We really focus on the others.
All right, thank you. I think also it's important to note that PFBA, I believe, is included in the health index calculation. So by looking at just the concentrations of those three, you eliminate that from that one alternative. The last one is the integrated, and we'll do that one last, as we're planning to draw from the other three groupings. Maybe there's and that's more of probably looking at the solutions that are good for 2 or 3 different communities. It's not a regional solution. It's not just a community solution, but maybe something that helps for 2 or 3 areas. And that'll be the last one we do because we'll just pick and choose what we think is our kind of the best fit from our perspective overall. And then moving forward, we've kind of got those scenarios now identified, and we've identified the projects for each one of those scenarios at this point. And so going forward, we'll be looking at the impacts on the hydraulic models, make sure these work, make sure they're feasible. Did we miss, does a water main need to be upgraded, upsized? Do we need to include a booster pump station here and there? Do we need a PRV or a storage tank? Those kind of considerations, which will the water system models will tell us that. And then the groundwater model, which should be completed in about mid-November. And then we can start looking at that to help us optimize well field locations, look at both supply, how much water can we draw, which aquifer do you draw it from, and then also groundwater flow. That'll help us identify well locations and maybe the potential, what we know today versus what may happen in 2040. And then the last one's on the groundwater model update, which Anna can do.
Yeah, just real quick, just to
give you guys a heads up, the construction of the model is anticipated to be finished by the end of the month, and then a couple of weeks, they're telling us for calibration before it's ready to actually be used. And then there's obviously a lot of writing going on to support what we've been doing so far. And Tara will talk a little bit more about that in her next steps presentation. But just pointing out that we have written a site's conceptual model or conceptual site model to kind of support the data that we've put together, and the DNR and MGS have reviewed that and given us comments, and so we're kind of using that to move forward, and that'll also be incorporated into the final report. So, any questions? At the end of the presentation, I also included Carson's information again, who's our point of contact for the SharePoint. So, you know, obviously these presentations get put up online afterwards, so if you lose his information somewhere, it's here, just so you're aware.
Hannah, a question about the groundwater model. Can you remind me, is it that Wood is just taking the information that's already been collected by other groups out there, or are we taking it another step forward? I was thinking there was some limitations to that.
By information, are you talking about data sets?
Yeah.
Or,
you know, well, so like Elmo has asked, can you make sure that you look at the northeast corner of our city where we want to put wells and make sure that, or, you know, evaluate the chance of PFAS going there. And I thought we'd had some discussions about how you guys weren't going that deep. So can you just kind of remind me about the context of what this model will provide for us?
Right. So the model is really going to help us when we're talking about aquifer availability, or, you know, groundwater availability. You know, can we pump such and such rate at this location? And also is going to tell us, give us a flow path idea so that we know, you know, if water or, you know, if contamination is here and flow is this way, we can make some assumptions as to, you know, where it's going to go. We won't have the granularity of concentrations. And then the other piece of that, I think what you're getting at is that these localized areas where there's issues, there has been modeling done specifically, I think, in the White Bear Lake area for that purpose, and we won't be down to that granularity. It's my understanding that later on, you know, after we've looked at the whole East Metro region as a whole for this purpose, that, you know, the groundwater model can then be tweaked, and we can kind of go into that granularity if that seems to be the right way to go. Otherwise, like I said, there have been other models developed for that purpose, so we would just have to have that conversation as to which way makes the most sense to go. John can answer maybe. There you go.
I'm John Seberg. I'm the technical lead for DNR on this, and I've been working with Glenn Champion, who is basically the lead modeler for the DNR on this. And Glenn has been providing a lot of feedback and a lot of input to this model. And so what they're doing is basing it on past models that have been developed for different purposes in different areas. And one of those is Metro Model 3. One is the Northeast Metro Region groundwater model that Glenn developed for evaluating White Bear Lake. On top of that, there's a recently completed groundwater atlas for Washington County. It has new coverages for the bedrock that's going into the model. Now, that may not make a real big difference in most places, but nonetheless, it's being included, so it should be the most up-to-date. And last part of that groundwater atlas was developing better coverages for the quaternary materials. That's the unconsolidated, glacially deposited materials on top. And so that's going to be incorporated at a greater, in greater detail than it's been done in the past. And it's going to be a much more current coverage. So does that help answer the question just as far as what's going into it? Okay.
So my question relates to the conceptual drinking water supply plan and how it fits within this process. So couple questions. So is this plan, when it's completed, do you see it as sort of broad and conceptual, or do you see that this plan is going to have a certain amount of detail? Will it be providing any sort of comment in terms of these are the projects that are of higher value? I mean, I know we've just gone through the prioritization and all that, but I'm just trying to think, I mean, like, here's the thing I was thinking about. So in our cities, we have a capital improvement plan. It's conceptual, kind of big picture. It's not approval. It's just things we're seeing out in the next 5 years, and we have our councils review it and quote approve it. It's not an appropriation, it's a plan. And then the capital improvement plan gets further vetting, and then it moves through the budgeting process, and then it gets adoption. So is this conceptual drinking water supply plan sort of like a CIP where it's, there's some level of specificity, it's still conceptual? These things will get vetted out further in the quote grant process, or do you see this as more bigger picture, global? Help me out to understand how this is going to be used and what it looks like.
Yeah, I don't know if,
What you can do, I mean, you're gonna be able to show well fields in specific blocks.
Yeah, so we're sizing well fields, we're sizing treatment plants, we're sizing water mains. Oop, there we go. Yeah, so we're adding details where we need them, because we are developing cost estimates. I mean, they are high-level cost estimates, but where we need to size, the footprint for our treatment plant to see if it fits on a existing parcel, we are looking at those details as well. So I don't know if you could hear me before, but we are sizing water mains, we are sizing treatment plants, and looking at that level of detail. So, yeah.
So it's not high level, you're getting down into some reasonable level detail.
As needed, we get into the details, yes. Yeah, I mean, we're not doing detailed design work, but.
I just want, from the grant perspective though, I mean, I feel like the report, the final version of the report will have the co-trustees' recommendations for good, better, best scenario. And so I guess it's still in progress as to what happens then.
Yeah, so the team, that Hannah and folks are doing, that's what comes out in December, which is a very technical review, including does it work with the water systems, does it work with the groundwater availability, what are the costs upfront, O&M. Then that's when the criteria we talked about are applied after that, and then comes up with a good, better, and best. And then once that's, as we've been talking about, that still has to make sure there's conversations with the local communities, because, what if some are, 6 of the 7's number 1 in the way that they work, they're, the other one might be their number 2, how does that all play out? And then we just go into start giving dollars once those agreements are made, not a grant round, but just shorten that up so we don't have that, 2-3 month period where there's grant process. It's just working with implementation agreements with each of the groups, work plans on the design and all that's done, and then just start getting the money out there. 1, it moves things along quicker. 2, it solves the issue we had with the expedited process and the data privacy issues. And so that's the plan at this point.
Thank you. Anything else?
That's it for me.
Okay, so as Kirk mentioned at the beginning of our meeting, that we have 2 public meetings set for next week, so on the 22nd and 24th, I believe. And the purpose of these meetings is really to just start to inform the public on our process to date, and then also talk about, next steps and what we plan to do. And also we'll be presenting some of the, the conceptual projects that have been identified, but then really kind of teeing up the discussion for December, January, where we'll be having the results from the modeling, and we'll be sharing that with the public then, and getting a more formal comment on those results. So we have those kind of second set of public meetings set, I think, in January to really get more comments, but we wanted to use this public meeting to really just kind of start the discussion, get people up to speed on where we are and what we're doing and what we're hoping to get out of it at the end. So with that in mind, we have developed some posters that and I don't know if we mentioned this earlier today, but we're envisioning having more of an open house session at the beginning of the public meeting. So having sets of posters around the room and folks kind of standing in front of the posters to answer any questions. So having an open house session, and then having presentations from MPCA, DNR, and MDH on the conceptual drinking water supply plan, and also just generally on where we are with PFAS sampling and contamination in the area. So part of that open house session, we have developed some posters, which we have in the back. So we have 3 examples of posters. We are hoping to have posters for each of the 14 communities. So outlining just a general background about that community, some of the potential projects that are under consideration that could potentially get bundled into those scenarios, and then talking about next steps. So this is our first kind of public meeting. We thought it'd be really helpful to get your input on these posters, just really to get a sense if we're kind of hitting the mark on the level of detail and the information that we're providing. So we just wanted to give you a couple minutes to just look at the posters that we have and hopefully provide us some feedback on that during the meeting. And maybe it'd also be helpful to share some of the thoughts or the comments that we heard at the last meeting. Actually, maybe I'll go through the questions. So these are the general questions that we have on these posters. So how is the general level of detail in the posters? Will it be clear to the public on what is being presented? Is there additional information or graphics that would be helpful to add to these posters? And then beyond these community-specific ones that we have in the back, are there additional posters that would be helpful to present as well? And some of the comments that we heard yesterday from the Citizen Business Group, that it'd be helpful to have a map of general kind of PFAS contamination in the area. I think that was one, so kind of similar to the map that Gary showed earlier for the 1007 project, but more expanded for the whole southern Washington County, East Metro area. We had some comments on the legend of the maps and trying to make the legend a little bit clearer for the maps. Having handout on health-based values, so having just kind of background information on PFAS and health-based values, so some stuff that I think MDH has already developed, and some other locations of key websites for folks to look at. And then also just an overview of the process, so some of the kind of summarizing some of the process flow maps that Wood talked about. So that's what we've heard so far, but would like to just give you all a little time to look at them, and would really appreciate your comments on what we've developed so far and see if there's any other tweaks that we could make to make sure we're really making the material for the audience.
Anything else to add? Okay.
Yeah, so we just wanted, so just take a look at the posters in the back, and then we'll reconvene in maybe 10 minutes or so. Thoughts, discussion, recommendations?
Thank you.
Well, I think maybe we need to start by clarifying what is the purpose of this meeting, these meetings, and what are the purpose of the posters. Because as I look at those posters, they're gonna raise lots more questions than they answer. I mean, they just are. So I'm just trying to figure out what you're really trying to do with those posters. I think people are gonna come there and they're gonna want to find out, okay, what's happening with PFAS in my city, and so I think that piece of it is helpful, but to jump right in and start talking about a surface water plant on the St. Croix, for example, just going to raise a lot of questions about that. And all of that detail about different types of projects and stuff, unless the plan is to go into some significant amount of detail about all that stuff at the meeting. So that's why I'm asking those questions.
So you think they may not really have enough background to know that these are kind of initial thoughts, that they may have some questions and concerns on what's presented there?
Yes, yeah, they're not going to have any background much to bring to that.
Do you think it would help just trying to add more text to the poster to try to capture that, or is it more that we need to try to capture that in the presentation?
Well, no, you don't want to add anything else in the poster, and in fact, you probably want to have about half that much information on the poster, I would guess. And so that's why I say, what's the real purpose of the poster? And let's just focus on what you want to get across in just 3 or 4 main ideas or main pieces of information, whatever that is. Yeah, because you get more than that, then it's even going to be worse.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that the purpose is to let the public know, where we are and what, options we're starting to think about. But I also recognize that, they're going to be coming into this without a whole lot of background, so it can be potentially taken out of context. So I think, we want to try to inform people of where we are and what we're thinking about, but we also want to make it clear that, these are just kind of initial thoughts that are being considered. So I guess I'm wondering, how we kind of show them where we are without overwhelming them or, causing too much concern.
I think it needs to be very clear where these options are coming from. In my community, they're well aware of my participation in this group and our 3 citizen members on the other one. These are not ideas that are supported by the city, so I don't want to create that impression that this is what we are supportive moving forward and raise some of those alarms about some of these options in here. So if it can be very clear that this is coming from the state, from Wood or something, but that it's, a disclaimer that these have not at all been endorsed by the city yet, or that's to come, some description about that process. And even the last one about ideas that came from the community, I noticed that all 3 of our communities had the same list of things, and that was confusing to me because when I read Lake Elmo's, I thought you were implying these were ideas that came from people in Lake Elmo, but then when I saw it on other cities, obviously that's not the case, so some clarification there on what you mean by community or folks in the East Metro or however, just to clarify that. And then I would certainly like to work a little bit on the introductory paragraph for my city. We're not just 5-acre lots. We do have a combination of that. So I just kind of felt that didn't fully encompass everybody in the city.
Very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that the list that showed up on each of the communities, ideas that came from the public, but I think we can try to clarify that. I think that, maybe the language was confusing. Thank you.
Carol, so you were asking if the people will have enough background to understand, and I don't think so. And it makes me think, okay, so this group has been at this for, 10 months, and we've been educated for that long. And so when we read that, okay, we've been talking about that stuff for months. So it might, and earlier you've said the purpose of this is to start to get people educated. Okay, well, I think maybe we need to go back to, well, how did you educate us? What are the key pieces of that education that should be part of this meeting and then reflected somehow very broadly on those posters. And so it makes me think, okay, well, so there are a number of ways to provide drinking water. Here they are. And right now, in this area, this is how drinking water is provided. And here are some additional ones that we've looked at. And we're putting together scenarios that we're trying to figure out how these can best provide those that solution. So I think that's the kind of education
It's almost
that,
like taking a step back
I
and
think
just
so.
more kind of conceptually, kind of, where we started and where we're trying to go, but maybe not drill down to kind of, these are the options for each community.
Well, and provide that background about how did a surface water plant on St. Croix get on a list? Just more generally.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
And I would echo some of these thoughts. I feel like that you're trying to do the work of 4 posters with 1 poster, and it may be a matter of breaking out some of that introductory information and not trying to squeeze it onto this poster, but having a separate one that describes what is a conceptual drinking water plant, what is the process that has gone on, what is the process that's going to happen, and then something that's a little bit more community specific, and you might include that list of options, maybe even not in a community specific way, but just these are the type, the full list of a poster that goes to every meeting. It's like, here's the full list of the types of things that might be considered, which would help keep from pinning a particular locality to a particular option that they may not have improved. So I don't want less information. I want less information on each poster. And as a technical point, and I'm not that old, but I could not, for the life of me, tell what the color of the bubbles in the legend was supposed to be. So the map was useless to me because it was like, okay, I can, and so those I had no idea what was supposed to mean what. And I mean, I'm only 45.
Same comment yesterday, too, on the legend. Okay.
Yeah, I can tell you about that old, and that's true.
I think that fits with my comment too. I was just thinking that less on the posters as we have talked about, but also the sizing of just if they're going to be on a wall or on a stand or something where a group of people is going to be standing around trying to read it at one time, it has to be a little bit bigger. I know it gets difficult, but it's difficult to read the text if you're standing in a group of people reading a paragraph of text. So just sizing of it's going to have to be pretty good size if a group of people are going to stand there together reading it. It's one thing if it's just individuals walking up to it, but if there's a group of 5 or 10 people around and you really are supposed to read that, you're going to have to think about the sizing of it.
Thanks so much.
I guess I'm wondering, generally, do the community-specific posters help, or would it just be better, not having these community-specific posters and more just having more generalized?
I think the community-specific maps are important, but I don't know if you need anything community-specific beyond that. I think the generalized information of the whole process, but I think people really do want to understand what their community looks like, but I think at this point, pulling out particular projects, it can feel to the public like a promise. We're going to do this, or it can feel like a menu, in which case, and I don't think either one of those things is what you want to get. And so I think by separating that out from the community, saying this is the types of things that are being considered overall, but we can't say at this point necessarily what your community is going to be facing.
Right. Okay. But maybe just maps of, kind of showing. And the maps back there, they're supposed to show the health indices, so whether they're above or below the 1. So maybe just kind of showing that as a starting place.
Kind of writing on that, in addition to not being able to distinguish the colors on the legend, which yesterday that was pointed out, that whole thing about what you actually have in the legend for what each color dot means, which is the health. And we've been hearing about the health index thing for quite a while here, so we have a good idea. But part of the problem is the number of digits you have there is ridiculous. I mean, 0 to, because you're trying to get 0 to 25, 25 to 50. just kind of bracketing those down so they aren't quite so big. But I think the idea of just the map and then the slides that Brian showed about the 4 groups might be kind of the resolution for this thing about the options. Maybe posters of, here's kind of group 1 with that kind of detail what all group 1 amounted to, because that kind of says, here are the ideas that came forth for possible solutions, and here's how we're grouping them for analysis. I mean, that might be the way we can get around this thing about the possible proposals without getting too specific on the communities.
Another thought I had is rather than having the options laid out by community that way, perhaps you would do a big poster board of that grid that you had before that showed the options that could be applicable that you're pursuing in each of the communities, and at least that gives it more of a broader context of the region where folks can still find their individual city, but you kind of understand how, Lake Elmo compares to Woodbury or Oakdale or West Lakeland and whatnot.
Do you think it's valuable to show on along with the community map to have something on there about existing water supply in the community, just a little summary, this is how this community manages their current water supply?
See a bunch of head nods.
And the number of well advisories that have been issued, that's helpful for a community too.
And again, thinking back to early in the process, I think even a slide or a poster describing what is a PFAS, what is a health index, how does that affect? I mean, some of that really basic information that we can all sort of look over. I mean, I would imagine at a public meeting, you're going to have a fair number of day one people who have heard that 3M dumped some stuff or something, and that's the extent of their knowledge. And I think that you have to meet those people with sufficient information to be able to engage, because they may be some of your best and brightest, you don't know, and so they need to have that opportunity to get educated.
Great feedback.
About 2 years ago, maybe, Department of Health came out to Afton City Hall and did a sort of an open house and presentation about PFAS and stuff. It was really, really, really well received. And so you might want to talk to Department of Health and say, hey, they had some posters, they had a presentation, so you might want to just check with them and see what might be helpful.
Taking notes back there.
Yeah, and I know they will be providing a presentation, but I'm sure they would be happy to also provide, they're nodding their heads back there, so thanks.
So I think one of the things there is a presentation, as mentioned, from Department of Health, talk what are PFAS, what are the limits, and what is well sampling going on. So that's some of the stuff you're just not seeing on a poster board. And then the presentation about the process. I think the main thing we want to do is get folks to start thinking about some of these options. For some of these communities, there are some big options that could change how they're being handled their drinking water. I'll use the example of West Lakeland there. I mean, some of the options are looking at, do you get water from another provider versus your private well? And how much is the public aware of that conversation? And is that first coming up as a realistic option in January when decisions will be made in March enough time for them to understand, or do they feel they're shorted and decisions been made? So I think it's a balance. How do we have the conversation to make them aware, to start thinking of some of these things? You're right. Some of these communities, it's taken them a while too, that are part of the group, to have those conversations. But we're trying to find that balance. So all this is very helpful in that regard.
And is there I can't recall from yesterday, is there along additional ideas?
Yeah, I think so. And did an email go out to this group as well? Yes. Oh, it's just okay. Yeah, I'm sure if there are additional comments that you have, if you could email Walker. Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, so we're close to out of time, so I'll just try to go through these next step slides pretty quickly. So again, where we are in the timeline, so we're starting to get into the scenario development, so that'll be happening over the next few months, 2 months. And then just things on the horizon. So again, we do have the public meetings coming up next week. In November, one of the things that we are hoping, or that we're currently working on, are drafts for chapters 3 through 5 of the conceptual drinking water, or 4 through 6 of the conceptual drinking water supply plan. And we're hoping to get out those drafts in early November, likely. So chapter 4 is on the modeling, since Wood is still working on the modeling. That'll be probably more like an outline. But 5 is on the water supply improvement options, and 6 is on the conceptual projects. So since we're pretty much have wrapped those up, we're hoping to pull that into some draft chapters that we'll be sending to this group, Citizen Business Group and Subgroup 1 for review, so similar to what we did for chapters 1 through 3. So we'll also be giving you revised versions of chapters 1 through 3 as kind of context as well. So that's going to be coming out. I don't think I actually have it here, but we will be circulating that revised Priority 1 criteria framework based on the feedback that we heard. So that'll be coming out as well. We are hoping to have a presentation on private wells. And next month's meeting, we'll have an update on the conceptual drinking water supply plan, and then discuss feedback on chapters 4 through 6. Then starting December, starting to see some of the results coming out of the modeling of the scenarios. So that'll be on the horizon. And we're also we're planning to release that to the public in December as well. And getting comments on that, and having a public meeting to discuss that too in January. And then pulling that into the conceptual drinking water supply plan and finishing that out by March. So just kind of next steps. So there are the LGU meetings that Woodard is holding this week, and potentially some follow-up after that as well, as they continue with the scenario development, and then getting chapters 4 through 6 out to you all. And we would very much appreciate your comments on those chapters as well, like you did on chapters 1 through 3. We found those very helpful. And then we have meetings set in November 19th and 20th.